Look, there is a small piece of land in the heart of Jerusalem. We're talking about an area the size of a few city blocks. And right now, in 2026, that tiny plot of ground is at the center of one of the most explosive debates in the entire world. Politicians, theologians, world leaders, all watching the same spot. And here's what gets me. Ancient prophecies written thousands of years ago may have described exactly what we're seeing today. Stick with me here, because what we're about to look at is going to change the way you see everything happening in the Middle East right now. Here at the I Believe in God channel, we teach the Bible like no other channel on YouTube. You want to learn? Then you're in the right place. Here's where we're going today. 6 stages. First, the first temple and why it mattered. Second, the second temple and how it was destroyed. Third, what that location looks like today. Fourth, the prophecies about a third temple. Fifth, the organizations actually preparing for it right now. And sixth, what all of this means for the world and for you as a believer. Bottom line, stay until the end. Each part builds on the last. Alright, let's start at the very beginning. For thousands of years, one specific place in the heart of Jerusalem has been considered one of the most sacred spots on the planet. A place where history, faith, and prophecy meet. That place is known as the Temple Mount. And to understand why the whole world is watching it right now, we need to go back, way back. The first temple, built during the reign of King Solomon. And here's the thing, this wasn't just a building. According to the first book of Kings, this temple became the spiritual center of the entire nation of Israel. Sacrifices were performed there. Priests served there. And according to tradition, the very presence of God dwelled there in a special way. Let that sink in. Not just a structure, the spiritual identity of an entire people housed in one place. That's massive. But it didn't last. In 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon conquered Jerusalem. The city was destroyed, and the temple reduced to ruins. Right? Just like that. Gone. That moment marked the Jewish people so deeply that they still mourn it to this day. Plain and simple, it was one of the most devastating events in all of human history. But God wasn't done. Decades later, after the Babylonian exile, the Jewish people received permission to return to Jerusalem. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel, a new temple was built, the Second Temple. And centuries later, under King Herod the Great, it was massively expanded, becoming one of the most breathtaking structures in the ancient world. This was the temple standing during the life of Jesus Christ himself. Honestly, that alone makes it significant beyond words. But again, history took a dramatic turn. In 70 AD, during a Jewish revolt against Rome, the Roman general Titus surrounded Jerusalem. After months of brutal conflict, the city fell, and the Second Temple was destroyed. And here's what gets me. Since that day, nearly 2,000 years ago, it has never been rebuilt. Not once. Let that sink in. So what does that location look like today? Here's the thing. The Temple Mount is still there, still standing, still considered one of the most sacred sites on earth. But today, at the top of that mount, stand 2 of the most important structures in Islam. The Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, both deeply sacred to over 1 billion Muslims around the world. And that, plain and simple, is why this location is considered one of the most sensitive and watched spots on the entire planet. Any conversation about changes there touches politics, religion, and international relations all at once. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Because despite all of that complexity, certain religious groups believe that a third temple will one day be built on that very spot. And look, this isn't a fringe idea. It comes directly from prophetic passages in the book of Ezekiel, the book of Daniel, and the book of Revelation. According to these interpretations, a new temple plays a central role in end times events. That's huge. And it raises a question that serious Bible scholars have been wrestling with for centuries. And here's what blows my mind. There are organizations right now, today, actively preparing for it. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem is one of them. They have been researching and recreating ritual objects, priestly garments, and historical details connected to the ancient temple. Right now, in 2026, not as a museum project, as preparation. Stick with me here, because when you see ancient prophecy and modern preparation happening at the same time, that is not something you can just scroll past. Hey, let's pause right here. If this is opening your eyes, type Amen in the comments right now. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel. When you do, YouTube shows this to more people who need to hear it. And tell us where you're watching from. Your city, your state, your country. We read every single comment. Honestly, we love hearing from you. Thank you for being here. Now look. The Third Temple is not just a religious question, not even close. It is one of the most politically charged issues in the entire world. Jerusalem sits at the center of one of the most complex conflicts in modern history, and any significant change on the Temple Mount would send shockwaves through international politics immediately. Right? Most experts agree that a literal reconstruction in the short term is extremely unlikely. But here's the bottom line. The fact that people are preparing, that scholars are debating, that the world keeps watching that same small hill, that is not an accident. And honestly, this question connects everything. Past, present, future, ancient history, deep religious belief, and some of the most delicate political tensions on earth. Maybe that's why this question has fascinated people across centuries. Will we actually see a new temple in Jerusalem? Or are these prophecies symbolic, pointing to something deeper? Right now, nobody can say with absolute certainty. But here's what gets me. That small mount in Jerusalem remains one of the most watched, most studied, most prayed over pieces of land on the planet. And its story, plain and simple, is far from over. If this study opened your eyes today, share it. Share it. Somebody in your life needs to hear this right now. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and support this ministry. And stick around for the next study. The link is right here on your screen.